When I was in college, I barely made it through college, right? I was one of these students that was getting by with a 2.5 average, and I was going to go work for one of the big three in Detroit, spying on American citizens I didn't agree with. We launched a couple satellites out of Russian submarine. This guy starts talking to me about wanting to show that humanity could become a multiplanetary species. Elon's up in front of us just tapping away on his computer. What the fuck do you think that idiot savant is up to up there? We went from launching about 30 satellites a year to this year we'll launch about 1,300 or 1,400 satellites. We don't know what we can do with these satellites yet.
Jeff Stearns, connected through cars. If they're bigwigs, we'll have them on the show. And yes, we'll talk about cars and everything else. Here he is now, Jeff Stearns.
Jeff Stearns, connected through cars with my good friend Jim Cantrell. Now, this is a car-related show, and Jim does like to drive, and you'll hear about that. Jim brings over 30 years experience to his current role as CEO of Phantom Space. Now, he co-founded this in 2019 after leading Strat Space for more than 15 years. He's also held multiple positions, for example, NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the French Space Agency, CNES. And he was the first vice president of BizDev for SpaceX with Elon Musk. So that's interesting. But he's an avid racer, an avid road racer, and the owner of Vintage Exotics Competition Engineering. Enjoy the show. I said if you can talk. And obviously you can talk, but if you're an engineer, you're not supposed to be that interesting.
Well, I'm not an engineer, so I just have an engineering degree or two.
Well, okay, excuse me, that part.
Yeah, so I got through 8 years of college, a master's degree in mechanical engineering. Got into the job, and I'm like, these people are boring. I'm not one of these people. They're not my tribe. So I've been fighting that ever since.
Oh, you actually. Okay, so I could be less cautious.
Right.
You actually felt that?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. Yeah, no, so, when I was in college, I was doing all these really wacky, fun things, with chasing balloons around the desert and collaborating with the Soviets and so on. And then, I got a job. I got a job with the French Space Agency, and it was designing things and attending meetings and documenting tests and things like that. I thought, this is boring as hell. So I had to figure a way out of that somehow. And that was the rest of my life, was figuring out how to stay away from being an engineer.
Chasing balloons around the desert. Can we talk about that a little? I mean, was this a peyote thing or was it some kind of science thing?
When I was in college, I barely made it through college, right? I was one of these students that was getting by with a 2.5 average, and they're always going to put me on probation and things like this. And so one day I found I was going to go work for one of the big three in Detroit, working on cars, because that was always my passion, right? Was cars. And so I saw this poster in the hallway one day, and it was a systems engineering course, space systems engineering course. And it was funded by NASA, and it was taught by this guy named Dr. Frank Red. And you had to apply for this because it was a graduate level course, and they were designing a Mars rover. And it sort of lit my mind on fire. And I thought, hell, this sounds like a lot of fun. I was kind of a space fan, I mean, it was, I grew up watching Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and that really interested me. That's what kind of got my interest in engineering and science. And so I, went up and applied, for this in person, and knocked on the door. And this is Frank Red, who's a retired colonel. He, looked me up and down and kind of gave me that, and I was jabbering on and on about how I, just build go-karts and cars. And he said, fine, you're in. So I got in this course, and we were designing, on the one hand, a Mars rover, and then on the other hand, a balloon. So it was kind of a competing thing. And at the end of the year, we would go to Washington, D.C., to present this to NASA, and it was a national competition among all the big schools, Caltech, Georgia Tech, and Rensselaer Polytechnic, and so on and so on. And so we went, and guess what? I won. And the thing that we were finally presenting to NASA was a Mars balloon. And the idea was, Mars has a atmosphere, and you could actually put a balloon there. Now it's like 120,000 feet at Earth. It's very, 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 very thin, made of carbon dioxide, and so you have to make very big balloons, very thin materials, and so on. So as a result of that, winning that, I got a internship at JPL. So that's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That's part of Caltech. That is a NASA lab that has made all the Mars missions and has sent all the stuff to the outer planets and so forth, Voyager and so on. And so, to me, that was a pretty big deal. So I went and did that. And the program they put me on was their own Mars balloon program. And what happened that summer, well, it was more than a summer. It was about 8 or 9 months I was there. We invented something called the Mars. And what this was a long titanium sort of flexible rope, if you will, made of overlapping cones that could drag along the surface at night and not get stuck in the lava and the rocks and things like that. Whereas the Soviets and the French that we were unofficially collaborating with had what I call the Samsonite suitcase approach, that the first time it would come across a hole big enough to swallow it, it would get swallowed. So this was sort of a small little part of my job down there, but it turned out to have a big consequence. And so we patented it, and the French decided to use it on their mission to Mars. So I went over to Toulouse when I graduated. That was my first job. And what was funny about it was I really didn't want the job. And they kept offering more and more money. And I kept saying no, and they offered me ridiculous money. And it was about $300,000 in 1989, which it's well north of $500,000 here. Now, it didn't go as far in France, but still, for a guy straight out of college, it was a lot of money. I was able to save a lot of money. So I went. I had to say yes, and I went. And so part of what I was in charge of the snake, part of the design, worked with the Soviets and under the French Space Agency, and then the Planetary Society was still involved, and they would host these. We would over here in the United States in the Mojave Desert, we would find Mars-like terrain to go test these balloons. So we had Mars-type balloons that were scaled prototypes so they could operate in the atmosphere close to the surface, which is much more dense. So they were smaller balloons with real snakes and real gondolas, and we would just let them go in the in the dunes in South California, in the lava fields, and one of my jobs was to chase them. So I was the recovery crew. I was in charge of the recovery crew, and I'm telling you, that was probably more fun than I had ever. We got these big Suburbans from Caltech with the big tires, because they were the geology department. They're used to going out in the desert, except they didn't know I was driving them, 50 miles an hour over the dunes, because what you have to do on the dunes, something that heavy, you have to keep going. And if you get the speed just right, you sort of glide down the lee side of the dune. And I had these two Soviet guys who were very high up in the Soviet space program sitting in the back seat. And every time we would go over, they'd go, whoop-la, and laugh their ass off. They just were having like kids, at the French government expense. So this was my part of my escape from engineering.
Nice escape.
Yeah.
A nice getting yourself started in life with that nice little nest egg.
Yeah, I bought my first house with cash, when I moved back to Utah. So it was a nice starting point.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Were you able to afford all the wives in Utah?
No, so Mormonism is a sexually transmitted religion, and I never caught it. You can edit that out if you want, or keep it.
That might be all we have. How long does it take to get a package like that to Mars?
So about the shortest trip is going to be 6 months, and the longest trip could be much, much longer, but practically speaking, it's 12, 14 months, something like that.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure I could have looked up But okay, so I'm just curious about that. 6 to 14 months to get something to Mars. And now here's another, because you're involved with this. Is the Earth really flat?
It's not flat as far as I can tell. So it would things would orbit around it very strangely if it were flat. Yeah.
You know, there's some of these guys, these flat earthers, that are just absolutely 100% convinced, and NASA's photoshopping all the pictures. You know, anyway.
One of my former jobs, I used to get death threats emailed in from those people, and we had to take them seriously. You know, we didn't know which ones were real and which ones weren't.
I don't know. What would be the basis of the death threat? What were they that mad about?
So one of them was upset that we were building rockets and we were propagating the theory that the Earth was round, and that we were, essentially stealing public investor money to do such a thing. And we're obviously crooks and fraudsters, and that we needed to be dealt with.
Oh, because NASA's only set up to take money because of the farce that the Earth's round, all that. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Have we been to the moon?
I personally know 3 people that have been there. So I believe each one of them.
Okay. Well, thank God. I can relax on that one. So now, when you thought that you might get a job with the big 3 and go to Detroit, and I'm a Detroiter, by the way. Were you a Detroiter at all?
Not at all. My wife's from Ann Arbor. She went to Michigan, to the university. So originally I'm from Los Angeles.
My mom lives very near there in Howell, very near Ann Arbor.
There you go. Well, go blue, right? Yes. So I'm originally from Los Angeles. I don't tell many people that because I escaped. And about 1979, I moved to Silicon Valley when it was really Silicon back then. And that was, about the time that Apple was kind of coming around and things were really starting to change. And we ended up moving to Utah my last year of high school because the semiconductor plant that my dad was vice president of, they moved it to Utah and then Ireland. So we chose the Mormons over the Irish, and so that's why I went to Utah State. And so I spent a good number of years in Utah. I've got no regrets. It's a great school. Shitty football team until this year, but we always were in the mood to beat BYU every year because BYU, well, they're worth beating. And so I went directly from there to the France. And what's kind of interesting is, back then I was, voting for Ronald Reagan and that sort of thing. And when I decided to come back from France, the people thought I was a traitor of sorts because I'd worked with the Soviets and with the French. And, here I am, so nobody would hire me. Literally nobody would hire me. So I ended up going back to Utah because my professor, Frank Red, they ran a little space lab there with about 300 people. And so he knew I wasn't a traitor, so he hired me back. And it was within about, I think, a month of me coming back that one of his friends from West Point, who worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, in their discussion, he said, yeah, I had a student that just came back and he worked on a Soviet, French mission to Mars. And he says, take me to him. So this guy shows up in my office, and I'm thinking, I'm trying to hide this, right? And I'm not talking to anybody about it. Yeah, and he shows up and he says, son, I hear you work with the Soviets. And I said, yes, sir, I did. And you speak the language? I said, yes, a little bit. And he says, we need your help. I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to help? And at that time, this was just about a year after the attempted coup d'etat in Russia, where Gorbachev was deposed and Yeltsin came into power. There was a lot of brain drain happening. So the Soviet government, the Russian government, was no longer paying its people, and so anybody that was working on nuclear weapons, ICBMs, you name it, was not getting paid. And so that makes for a nice, dangerous situation when you've got the likes of the Iranians and the North Koreans who are willing to pay them a lot, and they want to take care of their families. So I volunteered to be part of a program where we went back in there and started putting money into the former Soviet Union. So that's the next 6 years of my life was spent, playing around with the Russians.
Very interesting. I'm from the retail automotive space. That's where I spent almost 27 years in 3 dealerships, and one of them was we had exotic cars, Rolls, Bentley, Lotus, etc. And one of my great customers, and remain friends with them, that I want to have on the show was the fella that put Russia's first mobile phone company in. When I want to say Beeline, probably rings a bell to you.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I remember when the first mobile phones showed up over there. They were quite the status symbol.
Right, and there's a little bit of that still in Russia. You know, the G-Wagons and tinted windows. And
They have more Mercedes per capita over there than we do, for sure.
Yes. So I don't want to forget about Russia, but what gave you your passion for space?
Really, it's problem solving. I like building anything and anything that's fast and kind of cool. And, the only thing I've really ever known for sure I wanted to do in life was race cars. And I knew that from, a very young age, right? That's all I did as a kid was build, first little wooden go-karts to ride down. We grew up on a chicken ranch, and I had a driveway that has a hill, and we'd spend summer days trying to kill ourselves on those contraptions, and then figured out how to steal lawnmower engines and make them go faster. And then we graduated to steal go-karts and race those, and nearly killed ourselves. And then it became cars, which we nearly killed ourselves in high school. And so that was like the theme. And then when space came along, it sort of broadened my view that there's some cool stuff to do that is very
a better way to kill yourself.
Yeah, it's less dangerous in general, unless you stand in the flame duct, but
okay.
Yeah, it's a passion for building things more than it is for space itself. I've come to see space as the next frontier, which I'm all about frontiers. I always like that, pushing the edge. So that's what's really kept me attracted to it. And there's been times when I've not been too attracted to it. Back in about 2010, I left the space industry entirely because I got sick and tired of working for the government. It was government dominated. It was boring. They were doing things. I was working with the military. They were doing things with spying on American citizens I didn't agree with. So I became a conscientious objector and walked away. And, I couldn't stand to see the wars anymore, which I originally supported, but then I didn't. And, I'd see my son's friends coming back with body parts missing. And I said, this is wrong. So I left it. And it wasn't until the commercial money started finding its way back in. This is long after SpaceX, right? So Elon and SpaceX made space safe for investment. And once that happened, then all this commercial money started flooding in. That's when it became interesting. So, it had the dynamicism that a lot of industry has where, particularly, in a frontier economy where, there's money to do interesting things and people are trying new things out. And so it became a place of innovation. It became a place of doing, and you could get involved with a company and in a year cycle actually see the fruits of your labor. Whereas in the government programs, it could be 5, 10, 20 years before you saw your thing fly. And then if some fool on the team made some mistake, then it goes in the drink, and there goes that part of your life, and then you're drinking. So an example was this Mars mission I was on over in France. They originally it was Mars 92, then it was Mars 94, and then it was Mars 96. The 92, 94, 96 being the year they launched. Finally, when they launched in 96, I was well off of it, but it had a failure in the upper stage of the rocket, and it re-entered over Bolivia. So all those years of work went into a fireball, that somebody in Bolivia could say, hey, look, shooting star, So the commercial stuff.
Oh, disheartening.
Oh, it is. It's you can't imagine putting that much of your life into something. And not everybody feels this way, but me, I feel like, I've only got so many years on the planet. I want to do something that's interesting and worthwhile, and I don't want to do something that is just a footnote in some textbook somewhere. And to me, that's where I was going with the government stuff. And so yeah, I'm back into it in a big way. It's been very interesting. I had a touch with history with Elon Musk and that whole thing where I helped him start SpaceX. And I've come to see that as being a very historic, small role, but in a very historic way. And so I've sought to put that down in terms of the history books, and also to do something with it, because there's a lot of follow on to it. It's not the only act in town.
So you just mentioned SpaceX and Elon Musk as if my listener knows that Jim Cantrell has that background. So do you mind setting that up a little bit, talking a little bit about that background? Because that's very interesting, and they may not know who my next guest is and what he did.
Yeah. So sort of interlocking the stories as a result of the work I did in Russia in the 90s for the U.S. government, one of the things was we converted ICBMs to not carry nuclear weapons, but instead carry satellites into orbit. So turning swords into plowshares, if you like. And we launched a couple satellites out of Russian submarines. I'm probably one of the few Americans that have been in Murmansk, which is their submarine base in the northern part of Russia. And, we did that with some other ground-based ICBMs. So about 2001, after I was well done with the Russians, I get this phone call out of the blue from a guy, and I thought his name was Elon Musk. And it was a Friday afternoon. I was on my way home, and I had the top down on the car. It was a beautiful July afternoon, and northern Utah in the summer is God's country. It's just fantastic. Imagine northern Michigan's about the only thing that sort of competes with it. But so anyhow, I'm on my way home.
Only for 3 months.
Exactly.
But anyway.
Just like northern Utah. It's the same thing. Colder than hell the rest of the year. So this guy starts talking to me about wanting to show that humanity could become a multiplanetary species and all this sort of thing, and that he needed to talk to me because he needed Russian rockets, and I was the guy that he was told could help him buy Russian rockets. So, he mentioned this thing called PayPal, which I'd never heard of, and, how he just left there and so forth. And, I said, look, I'll call you when I get home because I can hardly hear you. And I said, fine. So I got home, said hi to the kids. And this was early afternoon. Went into my study and called him back. And, it was talk about cell phones. This was I had a Motorola StarTAC, cool phone. So I called him back, and I get a fax machine. And so I'm thinking, okay, he told me he was a internet billionaire and all this stuff. And I'm thinking, right. So use a fax machine to make phone calls. Good. Didn't believe it, So about 20 minutes later, he calls me back, and he's angry. And he wants to know why I didn't call him back. And I explained, and he's like, oh, okay, well, this is my mobile phone. And so he starts in on this whole thing about, sending mice to Mars and proving that humans could transit the time to Mars, the 6 to 14 months. And, that he wants to do this mission with his own private money. And, he could blow his money, drinking Mai Tais on a beach somewhere, but he'd rather blow it, with space missions. And so this was not, this might sound unusual, but it was not an unusual occurrence, to have these guys with a lot of money out of Silicon Valley wanting to do this. I'd probably fielded, 6 or 7 different calls like this over the prior few years. And this was, at the time the internet bubble was kind of about ready to burst.
And Tesla's not a thing.
Tesla was a thing, but it wasn't his thing yet. He was not a founder of Tesla, by the way. That was Martin Eberhard that founded Tesla. Right? He became an investor later and then forced Martin out. But that's a whole other story. So at any rate, so I had the Gross Brothers and Idea Lab, and I'd taken some of these guys to Russia and so forth, and they were always interested in this, and they always paid me well. So I, would do the consulting and cash a check and go on my way, buy a car with it or whatever. So Elon, was very insistent, wanted to come fly into our local municipal airport and come visit me in my home on Saturday. And I said, no, because I got kids. I don't know who this guy is. He could be a nutcase, and nutcase with a private aircraft. I don't care if he's wealthy. And so I lied. And I said, look, I'm busy, but I'll meet you at Salt Lake City because I've got to fly out of Salt Lake City tomorrow or Sunday. And he agreed. So what I figured is he couldn't pack a gun behind security. And this is pre 9/11. So you could go behind security without actually having to have a ticket and so on. So we rented a conference room, and he showed up, and that's where we started planning this whole thing. And there was a guy named Bob Zubrin who had started the Mars Society, and Bob's written a number of books called The Case for Mars and so on all this stuff. So he was the person whom I knew that had led Elon to me. So Bob showed up as well, and we started this mission, right? And so
now Bob showed up at your invitation or part of Elon's?
Part of Elon's invitation, yeah.
Okay. And you rented a conference room at the airport?
Yeah, it was in the Delta Crown Room. And so they had a little conference room there. And so a couple $100 I rented the conference room, and that's where we had our first meeting, right? And afterwards, took him out and took him to my favorite restaurant in Salt Lake City and watched Bob slop the soup all over the table. And then we made our plans and went about executing our plans to do this mission. So one of the first things I did was gathered a team of people around me because I had worked with JPL and knew a lot of the guys that did the Mars missions, the Mars Pathfinder that had been recently successful. So I called them and then some others that had been consulting. There's a bunch of us that didn't want to be part of corporate America, and I'm certainly one of them. And so I had a lot of friends that were like that. So I called them, got them involved. So we put a team together, and we started looking at this mission and quickly decided the logistics of sending, mice on a, 1,000,000-mile journey to Mars and back had its challenges that we didn't want to face. And I had some friends in Tucson, which I presently live in now, but at the time I didn't. They built the biosphere. And if you don't know what the biosphere is, it's a closed facility where a team of 8 spent 2 years that without anything coming across the boundaries. It was meant to simulate a trip to Mars and how a crew could live in a closed ecosystem. So they had designed a plant growth chamber for Mars that NASA wasn't willing to take the risk on. And so we sold Elon on this. And so it became a lander with a plant that we called Mars Oasis. So with that design, we went over to Russia to buy the rockets. There was a couple of launch vehicles that I was familiar with that would work, and so made the arrangements. We made 2 trips over there, and on the second trip, which was in November of 2001, we tried to actually put a contract together with these guys. And first one we went to, we were dismissed. Elon was 20-something. Guy who dressed poorly, and that's important to the Russians. And these guys didn't care if he had all this internet money. They, as the Russians said, they considered it bullshit. And they didn't know I spoke Russian, so I would let the translator do the work and listen. And there was all sorts of interesting derogatory comments about Elon behind the scenes, called him a little boy and things like that. So we walked out that first one after having the chief designer of the design bureau spit on our shoes, which was sort of a sign of we really ought to get out of here. So we did. And second group we went to were a little more westernized because they'd been working with some of these Western aerospace companies, and they also likewise refused. In fact, one of the guys that was with us, there were 3, it was Elon, me, and a guy named Mike Griffin. Now, Mike, if you look him up, became the NASA administrator later. At this time, Mike he just left the CIA. I knew him from that, and he was just consulting. But so he later became the NASA administrator and then Undersecretary of Defense under Trump. So later very important. And so these guys all bid us farewell, and in one afternoon sowed their own fate because. We started SpaceX based on this, and SpaceX put all these guys out of business, and at least out of the launch business. So all of Russia's commercial launch business is gone because of SpaceX. So we headed back to the airport that afternoon after this unsuccessful second meeting, and we were on the airplane, and Mike and I are sitting behind Elon a couple of rows. It wasn't very crowded. It was a Delta Flight 31 back to New York City. And every time the plane takes off, from Moscow, you feel like you're on sovereign territory again. There's a sense of relief, right? And so Mike and I decided to celebrate with some whiskey. And Elon's up in front of us, just tapping away on his computer. And Mike, he was raised by an Army colonel, so you can forgive him for speaking this way. But he nudges me with his elbow and he says, "What the fuck do you think that idiot savant is up to up there?" And I looked at him and I said, I don't know, plan 9 to save the Earth. And Elon turns around to us. He goes, no, guys, we can build this rocket ourselves. And Mike looked at me and I looked at him. We rolled our eyes. And Mike says, well, Elon, there's a whole graveyard full of dead bodies you're going to have to walk over to get to that point. It's not like nobody's ever tried this. And there had been a lot of failures, right? So this was not a new aspiration. And he says, but I have a spreadsheet, And I said, oh, Mike, nobody's ever made a spreadsheet of the rocket. So here, so Elon's like, fuck you, here, take a look. So he sends his computer back and we had a look at it. And surely it was a pretty good spreadsheet. And so I asked him, I said, where'd you figure this out? I know he had borrowed my college textbooks on launch vehicles and propulsion, but there wasn't really enough in there to do what he'd done. And so he admitted to me that he'd been hanging around with some of the other guys in the design group that I'd put together. And their hobby, instead of racing cars or doing something sensible like that, was building rockets in their garage. And, we're talking 30-foot tall rockets and going out into the desert and launching them and having them come down and smash all over the desert floor. So Elon would go out and seen one of these flights and just, it was sort of like he'd saw God, and he imagined that, hey, if these guys can do this with beer money, imagine what I can do with real money that I can raise, right? So that's what Elon brought to the table, is his ability to raise capital.
Can I back you up just a little bit? You said that you'd had 6 or 7 calls over the prior year or two of guys that claimed that they wanted to do something like this, and it was hard to take them serious. You end up in a conference room with Elon in this Delta, airside conference room. How long were you with him, and when did he flip you from you thinking it's just another one of these phone calls to buying in or wanting to actually take an action with him?
Yeah, I was with him about 2 hours on this meeting. And I would say prior to even meeting with him, he kind of had me because of his insistence on doing this now. And that was unusual. So most of these guys had a much more casual pace about them. But, it was as if his tail end was on fire and he was trying very hard to put it out, and he was moving fast as a result. And, he wanted to come to my house. He called me on Friday night. He wanted to be there Saturday morning with a private jet. And this was not normal behavior.
You're like, no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I didn't want him in my house, and it would be a little awkward. Now I kind of feel dumb, but, at the time I think it was prudent. The rest of them, like the Gross brothers, as part of their business plan. And, we did actually take some trips over there, but you could just tell by their sort of way they talked about things. They weren't very committal. They were interested in exploring what this might do. And, Elon it wasn't anything about exploring. It's like, okay, our next step is this. It was very concrete steps that he was taking along the way. And you could just tell he was very determined to do this. My only question is, did he have enough money? And even to the day I left, I didn't think he had enough money. In fact, I was right, because they got to the 4th launch of their Falcon 1, which was the original rocket that I saw the spreadsheet design of, and they were down to $137,000 in their bank account. And but their 4th one had been successful, and the Google founders wrote him personally a check for several $100 million. And that he invested that back into SpaceX and Tesla, by the way. And so that's how they survived that. And then what happened on top of that was the shuttle got retired, and nobody saw that one coming, really. Nobody saw the Columbia accident happening. And so NASA had to have a replacement. And so here SpaceX was. So you say I'd rather be lucky than good. Well, he's both. He's lucky and he's good, and that's worked out very well for him. But you could just tell, he's the smartest guy I've ever dealt with. By far more intelligent than me or you or anybody I know, and unusually intelligent. It's almost scary how quick he picks up on things. And as I dug into, once I knew his name wasn't Ian, it was Elon. I dug into his past, on Saturday, and I I could tell the guy was very, very real. PayPal was his second company he had started. So you can tell he had this serial entrepreneur thing. And he had another thing he called the Musk Foundation. And one of the things he told me that I still haven't forgotten to this day is, he explained his life philosophy is there's three things he wants to accomplish with his life. One is to show humanity could be multiplanetary species. Second is to get humanity off of fossil fuels. And the third is to develop technologies in ways that the tyrants and governments of the world couldn't control the freedom of movement of humans. And I except for the fossil fuel thing, I could get behind the other two. The fossil fuel thing I didn't feel as strongly as he did. But, what you would see is Elon was really true to that vision over time, Solar City and then Tesla and so on. And you could see that in his Musk Foundation website, and he was funding things. And so he just had the air of real.
Well, one thing you did say that was a little hurtful already is you said that he's smarter than you and smarter than me.
I'm sorry, but it's true.
You should try me on a couple of things. Like you can give me an out the door offer on a car and I can get you to, before tax tag, luxury tax, the county option tax even, within usually $100 without a calculator.
Well, that's smart, but this guy, I don't even know how to describe it. He grasps these concepts that are just really takes me years to sort of put my fingers on, and he grasps them and runs with them. It's funny, when I was in college, we were taught something called vector calculus, which is, you've got arithmetic and then you've got calculus and you got vector calculus, which is three-dimensional stuff. And it's incredibly esoteric and hard. And I remember my major professor, Frank Red, he said, he was a pilot, right? And he says, it's like piloting a plane. And I could start to, relate to this because I had done some flying. He says, when you're flying in formation in the Air Force, you tend to grip the stick really hard. And as a result, your stick, it responds to every little twitch in your body and so forth. And you're going back and forth between your wingman's plane. And so it's really dangerous. He says, what you have to do is learn how to put your finger on it and think about where you want to go. And then the plane goes. It's that sort of Zen, right? And so Elon could come in to these things that took us years, and we had to develop this Zen-like understanding of some of these esoteric things with space flight. I mean, some of it's really hard. Some of it's real easy, but some of it's really hard. And that son of a bitch would just pick it up in a nanosecond. And it was scary how quickly he just intuitively understood it.
You could resent how quickly he picked it up.
I could. I never did. I still don't, But, some days I wish I didn't have half the intelligence I have because it'd make my life easier, I wouldn't see half the things I see.
So would you go to space personally?
No desire. I did when I was younger, but doesn't strike me as anything I particularly want to do. I'd rather go a couple 100 miles an hour in a race car, frankly, if you give me a choice.
Okay. Well, I mean, like for me, when I watch a movie about space or I see some footage, I think to myself, oh my God, I mean, what an adventure, and to see that. And then I just think about, I'm a father, and I think like, would I really pull the trigger on going? And I don't know that I would, or I don't know that.
That's how I feel about it. It's a mortality thing as well as, I don't even like to get on an airplane anymore, to be honest with you. You have to really bribe me to get me in an airplane and go somewhere. First class ticket's not enough. There's got to be a lot of good reasons to go, let alone get in a tin can and go into space. It's funny, the first SpaceX flight that went up, I did a lot of press interviews on that, when they had the private astronauts, and I think there were 3 of them. And they said, what's the most unexpected thing you think these astronauts will discover? And I said, the toilets. I've known a number of people who've been astronauts, and they all say the toilets suck. And, not to be gross or anything, but, if you're going to throw M&Ms around, make sure they're not brown M&Ms, right? So things get loose, and, it's just not a very pleasant thing, right? I've got a very good friend who's bought one of those seats, right? I've been talking to him about this, and he's the kind of person that doesn't care for that sort of thing, So I don't know. There's just a lot about it that racing is kind of the same way. You get it. In fact, it's a lot, very much the same, because you get in the car, people come see it and they go, oh, wow, that's really cool. We ought to go do that. You get in the car and everything's uncomfortable. You're strapped in with a lot of safety gear and you're burning up. You got this Nomex suit on, and it's all for good reason, right? And this helmet, if you're claustrophobic, man, you are in deep trouble. Me, it puts me in a Zen moment, right? For me, I'm at home. I fall asleep in the race car in the grid. But then you get out on the track, and you either love it or you don't. And it's hard work, and it's gritty, and it's hot, and it's miserable. But at the end of the day, you're so glad you did it, right? And it's in your soul. You've got to be that way with space. You really, really have to want to do that.
How about new space? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so new space is a term that's used to discuss sort of this new commercial market that's come about, fueled mainly by investor dollars. So commercial space is not new by any means. Telstar was the very first commercial satellite. And some of you old enough to remember, Telstar was used, I believe, to broadcast the Olympics from somewhere in Europe, or it was Asia, I can't remember which. And that was the first commercially funded satellite. And out of that came a whole generation of commercial telecommunication satellites. And, your typical telecom satellite's going to be $100, $200 million satellite that goes into geostationary orbit, which is to say it's way up there, far enough away from the Earth that it orbits at the same speed that the Earth turns, so it looks like it's just hanging above the Earth. And so to launch that is another couple $100 million. You got a $500 million to $1 billion asset every time that goes up. So you have to, in order to raise that kind of money commercially, it has to be a very conservative business case, which telecommunications is. And even then, they struggle sometimes. But the government's a customer. If you watch DirecTV, that's direct broadcast. If you listen to Sirius XM, which I do all the time, that's another satellite kind of thing. So what happened in about 2008, 2009 was once SpaceX showed the world that Elon could actually build a rocket with private money, and he went out and found investors. Besides the Google founders, he got Steve Jurvetson, whom I know fairly well, put money in, put $50 million in his enterprise. Suddenly, it became okay for a few space investments. And as it turns out, I got involved in one called Skybox. They were some friends of mine out of the spy satellite agency that came out and said, hey, why couldn't we build spy satellites for $1 million privately instead of $1 billion like the government does? And I said, why not? Right. So I helped them. We were off by a little more than a factor of 20, but it was still better than $1 billion. And we were able to sell the company after we built a few of these satellites to Google for $500 million. So that started a whole wave of more investment in this new space. And, I think last year there was this year rather, there's close to $20 billion of private investments that's gone into space. And it's just growing, right? It's growing every year. And just to calibrate that number, the NASA budget, the entire NASA budget is about $25 billion. So you look at that much money going in, and I submit to you that the commercial private space is probably 50 times more efficient than the government. And I've got data to back that up, from some of the SpaceX stuff. Even if it's only 10 times more efficient, we've got a huge, huge change. It's a sea change in what's going on. So we went from launching about 30 satellites a year to this year we'll launch about 1,300 or 1,400 satellites. And that number is just growing. There's something like 7,000 satellites that need to be launched between now and the end of the decade.
And this is through Phantom Space.
Well, Phantom Space is my company that we're building a rocket to launch these satellites.
Okay. All right. Straighten me out.
Yeah, that's all right. they're, right now, most of them go up on SpaceX big Falcon rockets. So it's like a bus ride to space. There are no dedicated rides small enough for these smaller rockets to speak of. There's one company out of New Zealand called Rocket Lab that's doing it, and I had my hand in that one early on. But SpaceX takes these 50 to 100 satellites up, throws them out, more or less one at a time into orbit, and but the problem is you go on a bus kind of thing. We go where other people want to go when they want to go. So there's a lot of hidden cost to that sort of thing. At Phantom Space, what our business thesis is there's really two economic systems that are competing in launch, just like there are in terrestrial transportation. There's these large vehicles which are inherently more efficient, just like a bus. Per passenger mile, that's more efficient the bigger the bus. But then again, you have all the logistics issues with, where the bus stops and where it picks you up and where it's going and so forth, and schedules. Whereas, mass manufactured small is the other one. So this is like the personal car. And so at Phantom, we're building small rockets that are mass manufactured using basically Henry Ford's techniques from Detroit. Again, I pulled my automotive experience into this and said, there's no reason why we can't build rockets like cars. And we're also doing the same thing with satellites. So we have a bunch of satellites under contract. And ultimately, yes, we're going to sell the capacity to launch other people's satellites into space for money. But ultimately, our rockets are about what we can do with them, less than it is how much money we can sell them for. Because there's not that many people that can do this. And once you have that capacity to do that, now all of a sudden you start thinking about constellations of satellites that do unique things that you can make even more money on. So the value chain and the amount of money you can make gets better and better once you get into the data side of things. So in the space market, just as an example, there's about $500 billion a year is the market size being spent, and that's in all of commercial plus government space. And of that, about $20 billion a year is the launch services. So you could make a nice business if you had a quarter of that, right? $5 billion a year is not chicken scratch for revenue.
Could be worse.
Yeah. And then $30 billion a year for satellites, same argument, right? But then $300 billion is moving bits back and forth, around the Earth. So if you could do that in a better way, in a more efficient way, just having a small foothold into that is a far better market. So that's ultimately what Phantom's about, is I call those space applications, to, create enough of this technology so that I can engage with the really smart people that know how to come up with these applications. Like our mobile phones, never would have dreamt what we could do with those. We don't know what we can do with these satellites yet. We know some things we can do with them, but certainly not everything. And so my goal is to, through mass manufacturing, make this approachable enough, both financially and technically, so that these smart people and the app kind of thinkers can bring their innovation and have a blank canvas. That's how a revolution in an industry happens. That's how it did in computer. I mean, when I was in college back in the early 80s, I had to get in to my car and drive up to campus to use a computer and wait in line and so forth for mainframes. And, now I've got more computing power in my cell phone that I carry around in my pocket. So, but that came through, making that technology approachable. Websites are an example, right? I used to have to code my own websites, and now you can go out and get, anybody's sign up for anybody's service, and it's just as easy as clicking some pictures and putting them together. It does it all for you. So that's where we've got to go in this business. It's been many, many years. It's been neglected as a nation state kind of business, and we're just applying known principles to it, and hopefully we can make a big difference.
Okay, so I'd mentioned Phantom Space, and then you said we're talking about SpaceX. And forgive me if I didn't go as deep in my homework as I could have. Honest to God, no offense. You're involved currently with SpaceX or no?
No, I helped start SpaceX back in 2001, and I left in late 2002. And yeah, that was it.
Not involved. All right. And Phantom Space. Can we talk
Sure.
about that?
Started that 2 years ago.
And then before we do, Blue Origin. I think that relates more to SpaceX. Yes.
Yes,
no?
it does. So there were two people early on at SpaceX that Elon had me fire. That one of them was one of my early mentors because he thought that they were charging too much time. They were consultants. They went over to Blue Origin, and they started Jeff's rocket program. So those of us in the business knew that Jeff had I call it the Friday afternoon space club. He would, hold court on Fridays and have people come up and give him lectures, presentations on certain things. I went up, it was 2003, and gave him a talk on how you get to Mars, right? And using patch comics and all these astrodynamic approaches. And guy said like 3 words, "Thank you, Jim." That's all I heard from him. So, we were under strict NDAs not to talk about it at all, even though it was one of the worst kept secrets in the business. So, at least in the aerospace business, we all knew about it. And Jeff had a different idea, as it turned out. He evolved quite differently than Elon. His idea was that Earth should be the residence zone, the residential zone, if you will, and space should be the industrial zone. So, his thought was we should make space where most of our polluting industry goes, and return Earth back to its beautiful, pristine state. And so I think he hasn't taken any investment dollars from anybody. He's been probably a little more fortunate personally on that front. But as a result of him really not running the organization, Blue Origin, and letting others run it, and he brought in a bunch of ex-NASA guys. It looks a lot kind of like a NASA retirement program, although they'll be unhappy with me saying that. But it does to me, and doesn't have that same sort of fire and brimstone that SpaceX has. Elon, say what you like about him, he gets in there and he manages that company on a day-to-day basis. He gets very involved, and he instills a lot of action in the people. And Blue Origin just doesn't have that same sort of zeal.
Now, you'd mentioned earlier that SpaceX had like 7,000 satellites scheduled.
That's in the industry, 7,000 satellites in the industry.
7,000. So the real question is where I'm going, doesn't matter who. How many can fit up there?
A lot. So this is a question I get a lot.
It sounds like a lot of stuff bumping into each other.
Very well, at some point it does. It's not infinite, of course, but it's a lot more than what's up there. So it's important to understand a couple of things. First of all, once you put something in orbit, it's in motion, and it seems like a perpetual motion machine that never comes back, but it does. The atmosphere of the Earth extends out even to where these satellites are orbiting, and it's very thin, but it extends out there in such a way that it causes the satellites to decay gradually. We've all seen, like it was famous in the 70s, Skylab, or I guess it was the 80s, Skylab re-entered. Yeah. And that was the atmosphere that brought that back. And so
that had to be early to mid 70s.
Well, so they launched it in 72 and they abandoned it in 76. So it could have been late 70s. Yeah.
Now, I just remember playing with a buddy on my street in Michigan, pretending we were in Skylab, but I left Michigan, like 78. So I knew it had to be before that.
That sounds right. Yeah, I could have come back in within a year because it was pretty low. So the point I was going to make was the closer you get to Earth, the denser the atmosphere is. And there's an altitude under which you really can't fly in space. So that's about 150 kilometers or what's that? About 80, 90 miles, something like that. There's just too much atmosphere. It'll come back in a couple orbits. But the point I'm making is anything that's below about 450 kilometers, which is maybe 300 miles up, is going to come back within 5 years, 10 years. If it's above that, if you're say up around 800 kilometers or 500 miles, then you're talking about maybe 100-year lifetime. So that's the place where you have to worry, is up very, very high. And so what's promising to me is that people are starting to think about this, and there will probably be some at some point some regulatory requirements for third-party liability insurance for satellite operators for contact. Right now, there's no requirement at all, because above 100 kilometers, it's like the open sea, right? So if the insurers require that, then they're going to put a higher premium on lasting longer in space because it's a higher risk. So where we come in at Phantom, for example, is if we're going to make it easier for you to replace your satellites, so like your phone, you get a new phone every couple of years. If we make it easier to replace the satellites, then people are going to think differently about it, and they'll want to launch them closer to the Earth. The reason you launch them higher is not because of the performance. Generally, the performance degrades because the physics is such that the further we are away from the Earth, the lower the signal, the less resolution your cameras have, all that stuff. And so you really want to operate close to the Earth. But then if you're too close, then the atmosphere drags it in, and you have to replace these things often. But if we make it easy and cheap to replace them, suddenly we have sort of self-cleaning mode. So I think between all these things, it'll solve itself. There's a lot of people out there trying to put business cases together of going out and zapping stuff in orbit and bringing it back, and I have no faith whatsoever in those. But then again, I had no faith in the internet to produce commerce, so what the hell do I know?
What about these things re-entering and crashing, or do they burn up so much there's not enough to worry about?
Generally burn up, yeah. So some things, like titanium valves and things like really dense stuff can sometimes make it to the surface, stainless steel tanks, and so on. So generally, when you get at least in the United States, when you get a satellite operator license through U.S. government, if you're commercial, they go through a debris analysis of your satellite to make sure that stuff won't survive. So like circuit boards and that, there's this thing called the ballistic coefficient. So they just kind of float like paper, and because they've got a very high ballistic coefficient. But rocks and chunks of metals tend to survive.
Okay, I was thinking about that. I'm thinking about the 7,000 satellites on deck. And then I'm thinking, is it just going to be raining this shit one day?
We're a long ways from that. We're probably at least 50 years from a major problem. That's not to say the satellites aren't colliding already. I worked on the Iridium telephone constellation, where we lost one, a number of years ago to an old Soviet booster that's been in orbit forever. And these things happen. It's rare, but it happens.
What about tourism? Space tourism. Is it going to be like the Schwarzenegger movie? What was it when he went?
Oh, yeah. What was that called?
Total Recall.
Total Recall, yeah. One of my favorite movies, actually. I thought that was fantastic. I think that's, Elon's vision of Mars, frankly, is something like Total Recall. If anybody's going to make that a reality, he will, provided he can live long enough to make it a reality, because it's going to take a long time. But space tourism, the idea of paying to go up and get a ride, it's alive and well. We saw last Saturday another one of Bezos' rockets went up. I in fact knew two other people that flew on it. One's a very good friend, and people are willing to pay a couple $1 million a ride for that. And that's kind of a novelty income still. So I don't see it being a big industry in the near term. In the long term, it might, if people figure out how to do it cheaply enough, and maybe Starship will do that. That's SpaceX's latest huge rocket. So, who knows? I don't think, however, that there's enough people on the Earth that really want to pay, the price of their house to go see the Earth from space. I'm a space guy, and I don't even want to do it. So maybe that affects.
Well, I didn't think it was ever going to be those people anyway.
Right.
If it starts relating to the cost of their house, I mean, it might start relating to their annual or 6-month jet fuel bill.
Yeah, those kind of people will do it,
something.
right? And they can go to their cocktail parties and talk about it, wear their astronaut wings on their, on their lapel and all that sort of thing. But the average person doesn't really give a crap, to be honest with you.
All right, so let's go back to racing. This show's called Jeff Stearns Connected Through Cars. And we'd met through our connections are heavily car skewed, if not almost all. And then your background, of course, we're talking about it, and it's just unbelievably interesting. But the car racing, so you fancy yourself a racer. So any professional competition, or is it all amateur, and what are you racing?
Yeah, I've done some professional. I want to get into TransAm, which is a professional series, but that takes time that I do not have at the moment. And as I age, I still have a lot of friends that are in their 60s and 70s that are racing TransAm. So there's hope. I'm not there yet, but mostly amateur to this point. So I've been racing go-karts since I was a kid, and I drag raced a lot when I was younger and through about my 30s. Got into road racing, in earnest, probably about 15 years ago, and started with SCCA, which is the Sports Car Club of America. And then I found endurance racing, which has truly gathered my heart. And endurance racing is typically 3 hours to even 25 hours. I think it's the longest race in the U.S. And this is a team sport where you have more than one driver typically, and you have to have a pit crew, and you have to think about the longevity of your car. You have to think about preparation. The win goes to those who are most prepared and who've done a lot of practice and are a well-oiled machine as a team, as much as the car itself and the drivers. So that is what I've really enjoyed. I've done twice the 25 hours of Thunderhill. I did the 24 hours of Daytona Classic, which we beat Brian Redmond, who was a Formula One champion. And I forget who the other driver was, a pro. I was very proud of that. And he beat Bobby Rahal on that one. Then I've done a lot of national championships at SCCA, and any of these endurance races, the W World Racing League series. We run into pro teams out there, and for example, at 25 hours of Thunderhill, the last time I did it, there were 3 Le Mans teams and 2 NASCAR teams out there. And they were tough competition. They've got mega dollars, and they've got guys who do this as a living. And here we are out with our silly little Porsche, going up against these Le Mans prototypes, and it can be an experience, but still, it's an experience worth doing. So we do it within our budget size, and that's always been a lot of fun. Oh, I haven't gotten around to watching that last race. It's on my DVR.
Thank you very, very much, Jim. I really enjoyed you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah, Jeff.
This has been Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars.